Hey guys, my name is Evan Frericks and welcome to Epic Everyday. Well, it finally happened. Ben Shapiro finally had Ravi Zacharias on his podcast, and we're going to get into all the things. They talked about some really great stuff, but first, do you love the way that Ben Shapiro does his ad reads? Do you just want to hear more of whoever his sponsor is and love the way that he makes his guests wait while he sits there and reads copy? Well, you're in luck. You can go to his podcast and listen to him do it to his guests over and over again over at the Daily Wire. But seriously, this is a long-awaited episode. This was the top requested guest for Ben Shapiro to have on his show, Ravi Zacharias, and they had a really interesting conversation. I'm going to talk about what I thought was significant and why you should go check it out yourself. Ravi Zacharias proposes a really interesting challenge. I don't know, he didn't really frame it as a challenge, but I took it as one, and that is, are you seeking truth? Is that something that's important to your life as a person? And I think he would say that for Christians, it's ultimately important, and for people to thrive and to be fully human, it's really important as well. So what about you? Are you seeking truth? I think it's an interesting and important, but a not very often thought of question in our culture. To be a truth seeker, we have to believe that truth is even out there in the first place, that there's something to obtain. But do we live that way? Are we just trying to get the bills paid? Maybe we'll seek truth and really answer our complete calling once the kids are older, or once they have a certain job, or something circumstantial that hasn't happened yet. There's often things in the way. But if you're a Christian who's lost the pursuit of truth, we've got to try to get that back. I think Ravi would say it's so important to be seeking truth in our faith. But you know, the truth is scary, especially the truth that includes an all-powerful God in the universe out there somewhere looking down on our lives here on earth. So our culture has largely ignored and abandoned that search. And Ravi said in the first part of the interview that, you know, he used to be asked the question about the problem of evil at his talks, and now he said the culture, American culture, has shifted.
You're talking about evil? He said, yes. I said, when you say there's evil, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as good? He said, yes. I said, when you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law by which to distinguish between good and evil? He paused for a moment on that one. So when I looked at him, he said, all right, I will agree to you that there is a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. I said, evil, therefore good. Good, therefore a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. I said, but if you posit a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver, but that's whom you are trying to disprove and not prove. Your whole point is invoking a moral law, which you cannot invoke without a moral lawgiver. So your problem of evil actually disappears with the false assumptions that you're making. Do you know, Ben, he paused and he looked at me and he said, what then am I asking you? Why do you need to posit a moral lawgiver? All right, we'll grant you there is this abstract moral law. Why do you need to posit a moral lawgiver? And my answer is this, Ben. Every time the problem of evil is raised, it is either raised by a person or about a person, which means the questioner assumes persons have intrinsic worth. And that is an assumption they cannot make in a random evolutionary universe with no primary mind and personal being as our creator.
And I just love his criteria for coming to the conclusion based on the question that there is a absolute moral lawgiver alive and well in the universe. So I think what Ravi is getting at here is that when we talk about the problem of evil, we think it's a question framed to sort of either prove or disprove God. But I think what's really happening, because I think in our hearts we know that there needs to be an ultimate source of morality. It doesn't just come from, you know, logic or something like that. What we're really questioning is God's goodness. And I think that's so important to remember. Even for Christians, when we start to question God, when we start to doubt, we're really questioning God's goodness. And is that a path we want to continue walking down? So another way to come at that question then is to say, well, look at history. Hasn't morality changed over time? the things that we understand to be right are wrong. Like even in the Bible, it seems to endorse some pretty awful stuff. Slavery is usually pointed to as an example. And then now in our time, we're so much more enlightened and so much more moral. But I think Ravi does such an amazing job of pointing out that nothing really has changed since the Garden of Eden. So there's not really any great evolution of morality. You know, we're blind to our culture.
All right, let's assume that there is this eternal moral law that corresponds with some form of eternal truth and a lawgiver. So why has that law evolved over time? So to take, for example, the example that they like best is slavery. How do we justify evolution in the Judeo-Christian framework of morality?
Well, it's of course the metaphysical extrapolation of the naturalistic interpretation of the very origin of life. So when you talk about the evolution of humanity itself, they want to talk about morality itself also sort of evolving. I think it becomes a circular argument. The argument that somehow we were valueless to start with and just happened to be on this radar screen of time, and that we developed all these things over a period of time, I think is a false view of the beginnings. So then I would turn the question on its head and say, all right, if you believe that we have evolved more morally, why is it in the 20th century that we killed more people in warfare than all of the previous 19 centuries put together? So it is not an honest representation of how we have actually come into believing in moral framework. In fact, there are some things now that we have reversed over 5,000 years of civilized history. For thousands of years, some people never believed some of the things that we have begun to believe. So I would say that, to me, the most important phrase, Ben, in the Ten Commandments, I don't believe there's a better moral framework that starts with the very being of God and all the way to the sacredness of my life, my neighbor's marriage, my neighbor's property. I mean, this goes back, to 3,500 years ago. The most important phrase to me, Ben, and that is, I am the Lord your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt. That redemption is prior to righteousness. And then righteousness leads on to worship.
Some of the big things that our culture values are the exact same thing that were valued in the small society in the Garden of Eden, even when it was just Adam and Eve.
So what happens in the first 3 chapters of Genesis happens in this world every day. In the day that you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will die. That's the word of God. But the enemy of our souls comes and says, you will be as God, knowing good and evil. That has been the battle for millennia. What is the battle? To allow God to be God or to play God. And in the defining good of evil. And what happened when they are confronted? I didn't. The one you believe, I didn't, the serpent. This idea of violating the authority of God and becoming autonomous and then blaming everything else, this has not evolved. This goes back over 3 millennia long, and we have challenged it every day in this victim culture. What are we doing? It's not my fault. It's this person's fault. We don't believe in absolutes. We have autonomy. So on the one hand, we claim to be autonomous, but when we go wrong, we blame somebody else. It's someone else's enormous. So I do not accept this idea that it is somehow evolved.
We have people who are defining their own identity based on what's inside of them and nothing transcendent or external, and that's causing a lot of problems. And when there are problems, then let's blame somebody else. Let's blame religious people. Let's call them bigots. Let's blame somebody. It can't be me. It can't be a problem with me. And we're in the exact same boat. Ravi does a really amazing job in this video pointing out the difference between morality and sin. He says sin is a vertical problem, a vertical issue where we sin against God. The moral lawgiver. When we break the law, that's a problem between us and God. Morality is when we have problems with other human beings. Now, in our culture, we've lost the idea of sin. We've put that aside and we've begun to ignore it, and that's causing a lot of problems on the moral front. Imagine that. He shared this great idea that talking about morality without talking about sin is a dead end. And yet we do it in our culture all the time, and we want to blame God when there are problems. And that's kind of the bias behind that question. So all this really illustrates our confused culture, our confused secular culture. And Ravi used this really interesting juxtaposition between egalitarianism and elitism. And that sounds like a really weird thing to compare, but he's really talking about egalitarianism, where people are equal and people are equal to each other and valued equally so, versus elitism of ideas. He's careful to distinguish that. So we have a way to rank ideas from good idea down to bad idea. And that's an important distinction to make. And he said our culture is confused because we flipped that, where we take all ideas and make them equal, and we say, we're not going to distinguish one idea from another. Let's give them all the same value. They're all equally good, and none of them are bad. And then, now let's take people and rank them into classes and groups and subdivide and have them at odds with each other. And that really is destroying our culture. We live in a culture that attacks people instead of ideas. And in a civil and a right society, we would be able to analyze and debate ideas without attacking the person and just have a discussion about it. And that's one of the reasons I love Ben Shapiro's podcast. He is having all these different people on there, and they're just talking about ideas. They don't always disagree, and we get to see an amazing example of how that can play itself out. And when we when we make all ideas equal and we start to attack each other and subdivide each other, it is a real problem. At that point, because all ideas are the same, we've denied an absolute source of truth. And then people still want to say they're good, and that becomes a huge problem as well. How can both of those be? But again, our culture is double, triple, quadruple minded in many things, and so it makes perfect sense to them, even though it doesn't really make sense at all. Ravi also points out that our culture holds two conflicting beliefs: determinism and free will. And they want to be holding hands. But determinism is the kind of naturalistic, like we're just chemical compounds and energy waves and things that, we're just floating through space, evolution's happening, and can't really control what happens. But at the same time, people value their freedom and their free will, and they want to be able to make choices. And they're willing to let those ideas hold hands when really they're opposed to one another. Again, all ideas are the same, and we don't analyze them, and we don't make distinctions. Causes a real problem. Ravi also talks about the importance of freedom. And he mentions this idea that I want to think about some more. I'm not really sure what I think about it yet, but he says, dictating belief kills belief. Are some of our culture's most prized belief systems and ideas in danger of going extinct? All of the attempts in our culture to dictate this belief onto the masses through media, it just seems like there's these messages that we're getting bombarded with, and will that eventually self-destruct? I think that's a really interesting idea, and I want to process that some more. Ravi just sort of seemed to mention it in passing.
And so what I say is, we ought to give people the freedom to believe or to disbelieve. And we ought not to have a theocracy, because dictating religious belief is the best way to kill that belief. So I believe you give the freedom to believe, and the biggest place we need to be given this privilege is in our academic institutions. If universities would open their door to intelligent dialogue with our differences, I believe things will change. It is the fact that they have blocked out a prejudicial description of what the Judeo-Christian worldview is all about. It is not the Judeo-Christian worldview that is to blame. It is the way some people use their belief that, I think, engenders this kind of prejudicial reaction.
But it made me start to wonder, is America ripe for revival right now? Is that good news that these ideas might self-destruct and there might be a revival in the land and a rejection of all this secular craziness? If people begin to reject the ideas that are being dictated to them by the culture, what will they cling to and where will they turn? Would it somehow begin to make sense in the mind of our culture that there is a good and loving God who values freedom and wants to rescue people from their sin? And would they accept an absolute moral lawgiver to govern their lives? It also makes me wonder, where has this confused culture creeped into the church? Because it's inevitable. We live in the culture and it's going to enter into the church. Where have we sort of abandoned egalitarianism, equality of all, and begun to stop analyzing ideas and being really scrutinous with the things that we teach and the ideas that we accept into our mind? So in conclusion, I would just say, heaven help us. If we are at the verge of a possible revival, let's get in gear and get ready to do our spiritual work. And if the culture is just going to continue to self-destruct, God, give us grace to do the things that we need to do in this time. And just at the end here, I want to give you some truth. Whether you're a Christian or not watching this, you are a child of God, created in His image. You are created in the image of God, and you have a destiny and a purpose in life. The ultimate, absolute, moral lawgiver created you for love, and that is your destiny. And there are people who realize that in this world, and we can work together to do God's work in the world so that more people can come to know Him. So with that understanding of who we are in our hearts, that gives me what I need to continue moving forward and to take the next steps of faith, because I know I'm a child of God, and I hope you realize that too. So long.